Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Rosé Wash Process Colombia from Doc Coffee Roasters. And there's the box right there. And Doc, based out of Amsterdam, Netherlands. And they're a coffee roaster we have pretty extensive familiarity with, having reviewed a number of their coffees over the years. But in addition to that, I have had an opportunity to try a lot of their coffees, as there is a coffee shop nearby that seemingly carries them year-round. That being said, I haven't necessarily been their biggest fan in the past, mostly due to the fact that they offer a lot of heavier and experimental processed coffees. This one did catch my interest though, as it is a standard washed pink bourbon, and I do tend to enjoy those coffees a fair bit. So it'll be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, so Doc is notorious for roasting on the extremely light side of things, and I feel like a lot of people would consider this to be still a lighter coffee in general. That being said, it is one of the more developed coffees I have had from them recently, so I'm wondering if maybe they adjusted their roast profile. But this one's still a filter roast. It's still pretty light, so I would still say on the lighter side of things by most standards and metrics. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and ran it through the V60, and there was a higher level of sweetness than what might have been initially anticipated for this coffee, as there was plenty of brightness on the back end, which is typically my experience with this coffee roaster, but it was slightly bitter leading into this grapefruit feel with a long-lasting bright finish. So once again, very much in line with a lot of my previous experiences. But we continue on to day 18, ran it through the Chemex, and the first thing that was noticed was a much lighter body than the previous experience, but it still had slightly more of the fruit sweet components than initially expected, with a slight bit of this candied aspect. So right from these first couple of impressions, I was noticing much more of this fresh fruit and this candied aspect, and a slightly sweeter profile than expected. So the first couple of impressions were more positive than expected. Day 21, ran it through the April dripper, and the cup is moderately more tame, at least relative to the first couple of days, as there's a slight bit less of the brightness. It's been consistent though, in the sense that it continues to offer this grapefruit citric-like aspect. In addition to that, there's more brightness on the back end with this kind of fleeting, more pink candied sweetness that was a little bit more subtle and background, as opposed to the first couple of impressions. So we continue on to day 24, up to temperatures, ran it through the V60, and honestly it just felt like this coffee was improving with time, as there was another high bit of unexpected citric sweetness that complemented a long-lasting brightness. A pretty pink forward cup with a little bit more of that candied grapefruit. So all of these experiences continue to remain very positive. I've always found it kind of interesting that I don't really like grapefruit, but when I am able to experience it in coffee, it's one of the more enjoyable flavor profiles. Day 27, same adjustments to the Chemex, and it was surprisingly lacking the same sort of brightness given what this coffee was. I did fully expect this to maybe skew very heavy on the acidity. That being said, it wasn't quite as acidic as I might have expected. That's going to be a huge positive for me. Less acidity, a little bit more sweetness. That's a selling point to me, as it was a little bit more in terms of the bitter citric aspect, with the sweetness remaining a little bit more high than expected. A little tart in general, but for the most part, pretty nice. Day 30, settle on the V60, as it continues to remain above expectations in terms of sweetness, and I continue to harp on that because that hasn't been my experience with this coffee roaster in the past. They don't necessarily tend to offer the most sweet coffees, but given that this one was a little bit more sweet, especially for the expectations, I was quite impressed by that, as it's offering a bit more of the candied sweet aspects and much more of that long-lasting citric brightness to the cup again. So really enjoying the way that it's coming out through the V60, at least relative to the other methods. Day 33, coffee feels like it might have potentially dropped off, as there's a slight bit less of the vibrancy, and it's a little bit less at the forefront of the cup. So more of the candied brightness with an emphasis on the bitter citric aspects, a tart berry aspect that's offering this slightly savory herbality to the cup as well, a bit more of a citric brightness as the cup does cool. So I continue to list the brightness because once again, it was expected to be an acidic coffee, and it did in some aspects, but maybe not to the level I was expecting. Even then, you were able to notice that a fair bit within this one. Day 36, final notes, we have more of the same from the previous day, as it does offer a nice berry sweetness, but it is skewing more in terms of this undefined citric aspect with a little bit more bitterness, a bit more in line with previous dock experiences, as it didn't necessarily have that same sort of wonderful sweetness and a little bit more of that kind of long-lasting, very, well, we'll say distracting acidity to the cup. Even then, though, at this point, I had already felt like I'd experienced the best of this coffee. So we will move right into the tasting wheel so you can't see what we were getting. And we have a lot of level 4, so let's go through those, and we will start with the cleanliness level 4. No surprises there. This is a washed pink Bourbon coffee, and I fully expected it to score that level 4. And I don't necessarily have too much else to add to that because the flavor profile in this one did seem very well defined. So I do want to give credit to that. It's a very nice level 4 that they reached on this one. Finish, level 4. Yes, and oftentimes I've actually had some issues with the finish of dock coffees, as they can be a little too long lasting in terms of that brightness and acidity. So having that score at the level 4 mark is going to be a really nice thing, and probably expected that going into this one. But here's where two of the most important notes within this coffee come into play, as the sweetness reached that level 4 mark. Yes, there's a very nice sweetness to this coffee, and that's not always the case with pink Bourbon coffees. I don't always get the most amount of sweetness from them, and it's also not the experience I always get when it comes to dock coffees. That being said, this one was something that I noticed right from the onset, and it definitely justified that level 4 mark, so kudos to them on that one. Acidity, level 4. Yes, and I think we have at least one review in the past, maybe if not two, that skew very strong on the acidity, as I've had some extremely bright coffees from dock in the past. So having that score at that level 4, that's going to be a really nice selling point to me, given that I possibly expected that one to score level 5 going into this coffee. Berry fruit, level 4. Yes, a little bit more of the tart berry side of things, and given that this coffee was a little bit more bitter, tart in general, then I was fully expecting that going into it. And that kind of complemented the citric aspect to it, which was the most noticeable and distinct thing right from the onset for me within this coffee. That being said, for whatever reason, I really enjoyed the bitter citric grapefruit aspect that was present within this one. I think it paired really nicely with the rest of the cup, including that berry fruit aspect. So really liked that. And then we have a handful of level 3s. We'll start with the florality, level 3. Yes, it's something that I haven't mentioned too much within this coffee. If I recall correctly, I mean, it is called Rosé. I imagine that they have some sort of floral note on there. I could look, but I'm pretty sure that they had rose or something along those lines listed on there. Given that there was a slight herbal floral aspect within this one, I could see maybe a little bit more on the hibiscus side of things. There was plenty of red aspects, kind of pink aspects in this coffee in general. So the florality, noticeable enough for me to justify that level 3 mark, maybe not quite as pronounced as the berry and the citrus within this one. Stone fruit, level 3. Yes, oftentimes when I get a fair bit of the grapefruit, it tastes a little peachy to me as well. So that's a really nice positive within this coffee. And that's why that scored there at that level 3. Caramel, level 3. That insinuates the candied sweetness within this one. Really surprised, not something I always experience with dock coffees. So again, another pleasant experience within this one. Bitterness, level 3. None of that's going to be surprising. It was slightly tart, and there was a fair bit of bitterness within the citric aspect of this one, so fully expected that to score that level 3. And then the savoriness, level 3. As mentioned, there was a slight kind of floral herbality within this one, so it did lend itself a little bit more towards hibiscus for me. Even then, not quite as pronounced as some of the other characteristics, so happy with that there at that level 3. Final thing we have is the body, level 2, and I think that's one of the more surprising parts of this coffee, because given what it is, given the way it was brewed, I would fully expect that to score a level 3. But as I was making this tasting, I was kind of thinking to myself, this one doesn't have the same sort of texture, the same sort of body as a lot of coffees that we do score at that level 3 mark. So higher side of the level 2, but it didn't necessarily come out to the expectations I'd had for that. But I'm actually kind of happy when a coffee does not look like what I expected it to look like going into it, because it does go to show that I'm not necessarily overly influenced by the expectations, rather the actual results I was getting from this coffee. So I'm actually very happy with the way that this tasting wheel looks. I think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one felt much better than a lot of the other coffees I've had from them in the past. I will say that this is my favorite coffee that we've reviewed from them up to this point, but we do have another review coming from them here in the near future that I did enjoy a little bit more than this one. Also, I do want to say that even with me enjoying this one as much as I did, it's a little difficult to compare it alongside of some of the other Pink Bourbon coffees that we have reviewed on this channel, because I've had some really nice ones this year, and I have enjoyed them a fair bit more than I did enjoy this one. But that being said, I don't want to take away any credit from Doc, because it does go to show that there are some coffees that they do release that I do end up enjoying. I just have had maybe a little bit of rough luck with them in the past, but this is a nice step in the right direction. And as I kind of alluded to when discussing the roast profile, maybe it felt a little bit more developed than I typically have from them, and that might be a nice positive, because oftentimes I have felt their coffee was slightly underdeveloped. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, if you do like your Pink Bourbon coffees, this one offers that with a lot of the Pink Bourbon aspects with some nice complementary sweetness to it. This one had much more sweetness than expected, skewing specifically in the bitter, kind of more tart direction, but in a pleasant way. As kind of mentioned, those tart berries, that tart citrus, they were really nice. They seemed to pair really well in this coffee together, and it offered great clarity, great brightness, and just great sweetness in general, kind of giving it a very well-rounded cup of coffee. I love the way the tasting wheel looked in terms of just how well-rounded that tasting wheel was. For the most part, I'm going to leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Rosé Wash Process Colombia from Doc Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.